Story number 1.
It started on a bitter January night in 2018. Emily and her husband David had just moved into an old Victorian home on the outskirts of a small Pennsylvania town. The house, built in the late 1800s, had been a bargain, too good to pass up, they'd thought. They were eager to start their new chapter in this sprawling three-story house with its creaky wooden floors and ornate, hand-carved banisters. The first few days were uneventful. They spent their time unpacking and marveling at the craftsmanship of the house. There were a few quirks, doors that wouldn't stay shut, the occasional flicker of the lights, but they chalked it up to the house's age. One evening, while unpacking boxes in the attic, Emily noticed something strange. Tucked away in the corner was an old dust-covered trunk. She called David to help her open it, and together they pried it open. Inside, they found an assortment of old photographs, letters, and a small porcelain doll with a cracked face. The doll unsettled Emily, but David dismissed it, saying it was just an antique. That night, Emily woke to a faint sound, like soft footsteps pacing above them. She nudged David awake, but he brushed it off, muttering, "Old houses make noise," before rolling over. Emily lay awake for hours, her ears straining to hear the sound again, but the house was silent. The next morning, she decided to explore the attic again. As she climbed the creaking stairs, a strange chill swept over her. The trunk was still there, but the doll was now sitting upright, facing the attic door. Emily froze, her breath hitching. She was certain they had left it lying down the night before. "David," she called, her voice shaking. He joined her in the attic, but when she pointed to the doll, he shrugged. "You must have forgotten how we left it," he said, though his tone betrayed a hint of unease. That evening, they invited their neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Carter, over for tea. She had lived in the town her whole life and knew the house's history. When Emily casually mentioned the attic trunk, Mrs. Carter's expression darkened. "You found the doll?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. Emily nodded, feeling a knot form in her stomach. Mrs. Carter hesitated before continuing. "That doll belonged to Clara, the daughter of the family who lived here over a century ago. She died tragically, fell from the attic window. People said she used to carry that doll everywhere." "That's unsettling," Emily said, her hands trembling around her teacup. "Be careful," Mrs. Carter warned. "Some things are best left undisturbed." Over the following weeks, the strange occurrences escalated. Lights flickered even when the power was stable. Doors slammed shut on their own. The doll began appearing in different parts of the house, though neither Emily nor David admitted to moving it. Emily started to feel as if she were being watched, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck whenever she was alone. One night, as they lay in bed, a piercing scream echoed through the house. Emily bolted upright, her heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. David nodded, his face pale. They grabbed flashlights and cautiously searched the house, but found nothing. Still, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The turning point came a month after they moved in. Emily was home alone, working late in her home office. The room, located on the second floor, had a view of the backyard and the dark woods beyond. As she typed away, she heard the faint sound of laughter, high-pitched, like a child's. She froze, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The laughter grew louder, and then she heard it. The sound of small, bare feet running down the hallway outside her door. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she stood and approached the door. It was ajar, just enough for her to peek through. The hallway was empty. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no response. She closed the door and locked it, her heart racing. But as she turned back to her desk, she gasped. The doll was sitting on her chair, its cracked face tilted as if staring right at her. Emily screamed and bolted out of the room, running straight to the living room to call David. She told him everything, her voice shaking with fear. "I can't stay here tonight," she said. "Something's in this house." David came home immediately, though he was skeptical. Together, they went back to the office, but the doll was gone. Emily insisted she hadn't imagined it, but David tried to reassure her, saying stress was likely playing tricks on her. That night, neither of them slept. The house felt oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Around 3 a.m., they heard the sound of a child's laughter again, this time coming from the attic. Emily clung to David, tears streaming down her face. "We need to leave," she whispered. David, now visibly shaken, agreed. They decided to spend the rest of the night in a motel and deal with the house in the morning. But as they gathered their things, the lights began to flicker violently. The temperature dropped, their breaths visible in the freezing air. The sound of footsteps echoed through the house, growing louder and closer. Then the front door slammed shut on its own. Panic set in. They ran to the door, but it wouldn't budge, no matter how hard David pulled. Emily turned around and let out a blood-curdling scream. At the top of the staircase stood a young girl in a white nightgown, her face pale and expressionless. She clutched the doll tightly to her chest. "Leave," the girl whispered, her voice cold and distant. Then she disappeared. The door suddenly flew open, and Emily and David stumbled out into the freezing night. They drove to the nearest motel and didn't return to the house until daylight. When they did, they packed up their belongings and left for good. Months later, Emily did some research and discovered more about the house's history. Clara had indeed died in the attic, but the details were even darker than Mrs. Carter had let on. Clara's father, grieving and guilt-ridden over her death, had taken his own life in the house. Since then, every family who had lived there reported strange occurrences, with many leaving abruptly. Emily and David never spoke of the house again. They sold it at a loss and moved far away. But sometimes, late at night, Emily swore she could still hear the faint sound of a child's laughter echoing in her dreams. Story the end.
Story number 2.
I moved into the house on Maple Street in the spring of 2016, just after I graduated from college. It was a charming 2-story home, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. The rent was surprisingly affordable, and I had fallen in love with the place the moment I saw it. The wooden floors creaked as you walked through the hallways, and the windows, though old, allowed a warm sunlight to fill the rooms in the morning. I could already picture myself sitting by the window with a cup of coffee, reading a book on lazy afternoons. The landlord, Mrs. Wilkins, was a sweet elderly woman who seemed a little eccentric but kind enough. She told me the house had been in her family for generations, and it was one of the oldest in the area. There were some things she didn't say outright, though. She was very careful to tell me that the house had never had any major issues, but there was a strange unease in her voice when she spoke of certain rooms, particularly the one at the top of the stairs. "Just be careful with the attic," she told me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's a bit drafty, and I haven't used it in years." That warning should have made me think twice, but I brushed it off. After all, old houses have their quirks, right? There was nothing sinister about a drafty attic. I was young, eager to start my new life, and the house seemed perfect for what I needed: peace, quiet, and a sense of independence. It didn't take long for things to start feeling off. The first night I spent in the house was uneventful, just me unpacking and getting settled. But as the days went on, I began to notice strange things happening around me. It started small, a flicker of the lights here, a door creaking open on its own there. I would come home to find things slightly out of place, as though someone had been in the house while I was gone. It wasn't always obvious, just a small change in the arrangement of furniture or a picture on the wall that seemed to have shifted ever so slightly. But it was enough to make me feel like I wasn't alone. The strange occurrences became more frequent as the weeks went on. One evening, I sat in the living room watching TV when I heard a soft tapping sound coming from above me, from the direction of the attic. It was rhythmic, almost like someone was knocking lightly on the ceiling. I dismissed it as the house settling, but the sound didn't stop. It went on for hours. At one point, I decided to investigate, but when I climbed the stairs to the attic door, I hesitated. Something in the pit of my stomach told me I shouldn't go up there. Not yet. I stayed on the first floor for the rest of the night, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. The next day, I decided to take a look. The attic door was a bit more ornate than the rest of the house, with an intricate brass handle that caught the light just right. As I reached for the door, I felt an overwhelming chill, despite the warm weather outside. The moment I opened it, I was hit with the musty scent of old wood and dust. The stairs creaked as I made my way up, and as soon as I stepped onto the attic floor, I felt the temperature drop. The attic was full of old furniture covered in white sheets, and the windows were blocked by stacks of old boxes. It was a mess, to say the least. But the one thing that caught my attention was a large, ornate mirror standing against the far wall. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Heavy, framed with dark wood, and adorned with strange carvings that seemed to shift when I looked at them for too long. The glass was dusty, but I could still make out my reflection. I shuddered, feeling a strange pressure in my chest as I gazed into the mirror. It was as if something or someone was staring back at me. I quickly left the attic, closing the door behind me. That night, I locked the door to the attic and tried to forget about the mirror, but it haunted me. I could still feel its presence, even from downstairs. The tapping sound continued that evening, growing louder as if it was drawing closer. Over the following days, the strange occurrences only escalated. I began to hear footsteps in the hallway when no one was there. My bedroom door would creak open in the middle of the night, and when I would go to check, no one would be in the hallway. One night, I awoke to find the bathroom light on, despite having turned it off before bed. I walked into the bathroom only to see that the mirror was fogged up with condensation, except for one small patch in the center where something had been written. I wiped it away, my hand trembling, but the words were still there. Get out. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Maybe I had accidentally left the light on. Maybe the mirror was just fogging up in a weird pattern. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. By the third week, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every corner of the house felt off. The walls felt too close, as if they were pressing in on me. One evening, I decided to leave the house for a while, just to get away from the oppressive atmosphere. As I was about to step outside, I glanced up at the window in the attic. For a split second, I saw a figure standing in the glass, faint, shadowy, but unmistakable. I froze, my heart racing, but when I blinked, the figure was gone. I didn't know who to talk to about this. I felt like no one would believe me. People would think I was just stressed out from moving or dealing with the pressure of my new job. But then something happened that made it all too real. It was a Sunday afternoon, and I had been sitting at my kitchen table, trying to relax with a cup of tea. The sun was shining, and the house was unusually still. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of a door opening upstairs, the attic door. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up as I stood up to check. The door wasn't just ajar. It was wide open. My heart skipped a beat. I knew I had locked that door before I went to bed the night before. I cautiously made my way up the stairs, my legs shaking with each step. When I reached the top, I could hear it, the faint sound of whispering coming from the attic. My breath caught in my throat. I took a deep breath, opened the door, and stepped inside. The attic was colder than it had ever been before, and the mirror was in the exact same position, but this time, something was different. There was something on the glass, more words, written in the same foggy condensation. I never left. I turned to run, but before I could reach the stairs, I heard a voice. Clear, sharp, and unmistakable. Leave. I bolted out of the attic, slamming the door behind me. I didn't care about the rest of the house at that moment. I grabbed my things and left, not bothering to lock the door behind me. I didn't look back. The feeling of being watched never left me, and the house was not a place I was willing to return to. I don't know who or what was in that house, but I know one thing for sure. I was never meant to stay there. The memory of the mirror and the voice still lingers with me to this day.
Story number 3.
I moved into my apartment in 2018, a one-bedroom unit in a building tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and after a few years of living with roommates, I was grateful for the peace. The building was older, maybe from the 1950s, with creaky floorboards and a slightly musty smell in the hallways, but it had character, and I didn't mind the age. The rent was affordable, and the landlord, Mr. Patterson, was friendly, if always ready with a smile when I saw him in passing. He'd given me a quick tour of the place when I moved in and warned me to be careful with the plumbing. It had a tendency to get temperamental. It didn't take long for me to get settled. I had everything unpacked within a couple of days and was enjoying the quiet solitude. The apartment had 2 main rooms. The living room, which had an old but comfortable couch and a small coffee table, and the bedroom, which had a queen-sized bed near the window. There was a small kitchen and a bathroom tucked away at the end of the hall. Nothing extraordinary, but it was perfect for me. I would spend my nights reading books or watching TV, enjoying the silence. But it didn't take long for things to start feeling off. At first, it was subtle, a soft tapping noise in the walls at night, or the occasional flickering light. Nothing alarming, just the sounds of an old building. Then I started hearing footsteps, not from the apartment next door, but from above. The building had 3 floors, and my unit was on the second. I would be sitting on the couch, reading, and suddenly hear the distinct sound of footsteps pacing across the floor above me. It wasn't the typical sound of someone walking. It was deliberate, heavy. Not like a light footstep, but more like someone pacing back and forth. It would happen at night, always when the house was quiet. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or perhaps a neighbor walking around. But as the nights went on, the pacing grew louder. Sometimes it would stop suddenly, and sometimes it would continue for hours. I began to feel unnerved. I would try to ignore it, telling myself it was nothing, just the house settling or the sound of someone upstairs. But one night, the footsteps sounded closer. So close, in fact, that it seemed like they were coming from right above my head, in the very room where I sat. I tried to talk myself out of it. I was being paranoid, I thought. The apartment was old, and the sound of the steps could have been anything. But that night, the footsteps were joined by something else, whispers. They started faintly, as though someone was talking very softly. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It wasn't a conversation. It was a single voice, murmuring, as though someone was talking to themselves in a room above me. My heart began to race. I tried to focus on the TV, but the sound of the whispering was growing louder. It wasn't my imagination anymore. I decided I'd had enough. I grabbed my phone and texted Mr. Patterson, asking him if he knew anything about the noise in the apartment. His response was quick. "Oh, you must be hearing the neighbors. The tenants upstairs are a bit eccentric. But don't worry, they don't cause any trouble. I've had the building checked a few times, and there's nothing to be concerned about, just old pipes, I suppose." I felt a little better after that. Perhaps the neighbors really were just loud, eccentric people. Maybe it wasn't anything supernatural. I tried to go back to sleep that night, but the whispers didn't stop. They seemed to grow louder until I could hear them clearly in my own bedroom. The next day, I did something I hadn't yet done. I went up to the 3rd floor to introduce myself to the tenants. I figured if there was a legitimate explanation for the noise, I could at least meet them and get a sense of whether they were the cause. I knocked on the door and waited. A few moments passed before a woman in her late 30s opened the door. She was friendly enough, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hi, I'm Claire. I live downstairs," I said, trying to keep my tone casual. "I was wondering if you've been having any issues with the plumbing or anything. I've been hearing some noises from upstairs." The woman's eyes flickered for a moment, as though she was considering how to answer. Then she smiled, a little too tightly. "Oh, you know," she said, "it's an old building. Things creak. I wouldn't worry too much. We're just a little old-fashioned, I suppose." She looked away for a brief moment before looking back at me. "But if it's bothering you, just let me know. We don't want to be a nuisance." I smiled back, nodding, but I could tell something was off. There was an unease in her voice, as though she was hiding something. I thanked her and left, feeling even more unsettled than before. That night, the whispering grew louder. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It sounded like multiple voices, low and unintelligible, like a distant conversation I couldn't understand. The footsteps, too, had changed. They were no longer pacing. Now they were dragging, slow and deliberate, as though someone was walking with difficulty. I didn't want to confront the tenants again. Something in the air felt wrong, like I was intruding on something I shouldn't be asking about. I stayed in my apartment that night, trying to ignore the sounds, but it was impossible. The whispers didn't stop, and the dragging footsteps grew louder and closer. Around 3 a.m., I finally had enough. I grabbed a flashlight and went up to the 3rd floor, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to find, but I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer with the noise driving me mad. When I reached the door, I hesitated. I didn't want to cause trouble or make the situation worse, but then the door opened before I could knock. The woman from earlier stood there, looking at me with a strange expression. "Claire," she said, her voice now softer, almost sad, "you shouldn't be here. I keep hearing noises. It's like there's someone in the walls, whispering." My voice faltered, but she interrupted me. "I told you not to worry. It's just the house," she said quickly, stepping aside to let me in. "Come inside. I'll show you." I stepped into the dimly lit apartment. It was oddly cold, despite the fact that it was a warm night outside. The air was thick with dust and something else, something sour. There, I glanced around but didn't see anything out of the ordinary. The place was sparsely furnished, with only a few chairs and a table in the corner. Suddenly, I felt a cold breeze rush past me, as if something had moved behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. "Claire?" I called out, but she wasn't there. The apartment was eerily silent. Then I heard it, the footsteps dragging slowly across the floor, and the whispers, louder than ever, coming from the back of the apartment. I turned, frozen in place. The figure of a man appeared in the hallway, his face pale and drawn. His eyes were wide, but there was no warmth in them, just an empty, hollow stare. "Leave," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the dragging footsteps. I turned and ran out of the apartment, my heart racing, the whispers and footsteps still echoing in my mind. I didn't stop until I was back downstairs in my own apartment, locked in and trembling. The next day, I moved out. I couldn't get away fast enough. As for the woman upstairs, I never saw her again. Mr. Patterson told me she had moved out suddenly, and he hadn't heard from her in weeks. I've never been back to that building, and I don't know who or what I encountered that night. But I know one thing for sure. There are things in that place that no one should ever try to understand. Story the end.
Story number 4.
I never believed in ghosts. Not once had I ever seen anything to make me question my skepticism. But then I moved into that old house on Cedar Avenue, and everything changed. This happened in 2016, and to this day, I can still remember the unsettling feeling that never really went away. I was living in a small town outside of Portland, Oregon, and had just accepted a new job at a local marketing firm. My previous apartment was cramped, and I needed more space. So when I found an affordable house for rent, I jumped at the chance. The house was in a quiet neighborhood, with trees lining the streets and old homes with well-maintained lawns. It seemed perfect. A 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom, 2-story house that looked like it belonged in a postcard. The landlord assured me that the house had been well taken care of over the years. It had a history, though, which at the time didn't bother me. People love to tell you stories about old houses, but I figured it was just another one of those things people say to add to the charm. The first couple of weeks were blissfully uneventful. The house had a cozy atmosphere, the wooden floors creaked underfoot, and the air smelled faintly of old wood and dust. But there was something else, a sense of quiet. Almost too much silence. The kind of silence that seems to fill the air, making it feel like the house is always waiting for something. One afternoon after work, I was sitting in the living room, unpacking some of the last boxes. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the windows. That's when I first heard it, the sound of footsteps from upstairs. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but the footsteps were deliberate, almost as if someone was walking around up there. I got up to check, but no one was in the house except me. I thought maybe the wind had caused the house to shift or that the pipes were making noise, but the footsteps continued for days after that. The sounds were subtle, almost like muffled shuffling, soft and intermittent. But one night, as I sat in bed, I distinctly heard a creak from the floorboards above my bedroom. It was heavy, as if someone had stepped down hard on the floor. I froze. There was no one else in the house, and I had locked all the doors. The air in my room seemed to grow cold, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I sat up in bed and stared at the ceiling. It felt like something was watching me. I checked every room in the house, but there was nothing. I figured I was just tired, overworked, and probably imagining things. But the next night, it happened again. And the night after that. The worst part was when the lights began flickering. I noticed it mostly in the kitchen. I'd be standing there, making dinner, and suddenly the light above the sink would flicker before going out completely. At first, I figured it was just a bad bulb, but when I replaced it, the same thing happened. The light would flicker and then die. I tried different bulbs, different fixtures, but the problem persisted. It was hard to ignore after a while. The combination of the footsteps, the flickering lights, and the general unease made me uncomfortable, but I didn't want to admit to myself that something was wrong. I was rational, after all. I needed a reason before I could convince myself that anything supernatural was at play. I tried to talk to my neighbors to see if anyone else had noticed anything strange. Mrs. Walker, who lived next door, was an older woman who had been living on Cedar Avenue for years. She was kind and quick to offer me a cup of tea whenever she saw me outside. One afternoon, I casually asked her if she knew anything about the house's history. Her face tightened and she hesitated before responding. "That house has been there a long time," she said slowly. "The people who lived there before you, well, they didn't stay long. People come and go, but there's always something strange about that place." I asked her to elaborate, but she just shook her head, saying it wasn't her place to talk about it. She had seen a lot in her time, she said, but some things were better left unsaid. That night, I sat in the living room feeling more uneasy than ever. The wind outside howled against the windows, and the trees in the yard swayed. I could hear the familiar creaks from upstairs again, this time louder and more persistent. I tried to ignore it, but then I heard something else. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper. It was coming from the hallway outside the living room. I got up slowly, my heart racing. The whisper grew louder. "Help me! Help me!" The voice was faint but clear. I walked into the hallway, but there was no one there. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation for what was happening. I grabbed my phone and searched for the history of the house, hoping to find something that could explain the strange events. That's when I came across an article about the house from a local news outlet. The story was brief, but it mentioned a fire that had taken place in the house in the 1950s. A family had lived there at the time, and the fire had claimed the life of a young girl. Her name was Emily. According to the article, the fire had been caused by faulty wiring, but there were rumors that it might have been an accident. Emily's death was particularly tragic because her parents had been away that night, leaving her alone in the house. The fire had been so intense that they hadn't been able to recover her body for days. I sat there, reading the article over and over. The more I read, the more the pieces started to fall into place. I had heard footsteps, flickering lights, whispers in the dark, and the name Emily kept echoing in my mind. The next few nights were the worst. The whispering voices grew louder, and I began to feel like I was being followed around the house. The air was always colder in the hallway near the stairs, and the shadows seemed darker. I started to notice things out of place. My keys moved, my books were rearranged, and objects I hadn't touched were found in different rooms. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps again, but this time they were coming from inside my room. My heart stopped when I felt a cold hand brush against my face. I bolted upright in bed, gasping for breath, but when I looked around, no one was there. The room was completely still, and the air was thick with tension. The following morning, I reached out to a local paranormal investigator, a woman named Clara. She arrived a few days later, bringing with her various tools to assess the situation. We spent hours walking through the house as she set up equipment, trying to capture any evidence of paranormal activity. By the time night fell, we were sitting in the living room, waiting. The air was unnaturally still. I could feel the weight of something pressing down on me. That's when Clara's equipment started picking up strange readings. The temperature dropped sharply in certain areas of the house, especially near the stairs and the hallway outside the guest bedroom. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and a soft whisper filled the air. Clara's eyes widened as she stood up, listening closely. "She's here," she said in a hushed voice. I could feel it then, the presence, the coldness, the heaviness. It was like someone was standing right behind me, but when I turned around, no one was there. Clara continued her work, and after a few tense moments, she spoke softly. There's a young spirit here. Her name is Emily, and she's trapped in this house. She's been trying to get your attention for a reason." Clara explained that Emily's spirit had never crossed over after the fire. She was stuck, unable to find peace. The only way to help her was to acknowledge her presence and give her the opportunity to move on. That night, I sat in the dark, in the very room where Emily had perished, and I spoke her name aloud, telling her that she wasn't alone anymore. I apologized for what had happened to her, even though I wasn't sure if I was apologizing to a spirit or just to the air around me. The next morning, the house felt different. The heaviness was gone, the air was warmer, and the footsteps ceased. I never heard the whispers again, and the flickering light stopped. I eventually moved out of that house a few months later, not because of the ghost, but because I found a new job in a different city. But I'll never forget the eerie feeling that place left on me, the feeling of something unfinished, waiting for closure. Emily's presence was real, and though she never said goodbye, I believe she finally found peace.
Story number 5.
I moved into the small 2-bedroom house on Oakwood Drive in 2017. It wasn't the kind of house I'd imagined for myself, older, a bit worn around the edges, but it had charm and a certain quiet allure. The rent was reasonable, and the neighborhood was peaceful. It was exactly what I needed after a chaotic year of transitioning from a college dorm to real life. The house had been vacant for a few months before I moved in, which I found strange. The landlord, Mrs. Wynne Holloway, was an older woman who had lived in the area for years. She was pleasant enough, but something about her seemed distant, as though she didn't want to talk too much about the house itself. She mentioned a few things about its history, nothing extraordinary, before handing over the keys. She seemed eager to get the paperwork done and move on. The first few days were peaceful. The house had a strange kind of stillness that I hadn't quite anticipated. The walls creaked a little, and the floors had that faint, unsettling sound of settling. It was old, but I didn't mind it. I was used to the sounds of a house, especially in my own space. It was cozy, and for the most part, I enjoyed the solitude. But there were a few oddities. The first time I heard the noises from upstairs, I brushed them off. It was a late night, probably around midnight, and I was sitting in the living room watching a movie. I'd heard the floorboards creak upstairs, like someone had been walking around. I figured it was the house shifting, maybe the wind making the upstairs bedroom door creak open. It didn't seem like anything out of the ordinary, but something about the timing made my skin prickle. The noises continued sporadically for a few days, but I didn't think much of it. Houses make noises. At least, that's what I told myself. Then one evening, while I was cooking dinner, I noticed the door to the upstairs bedroom was wide open. I didn't remember leaving it that way. In fact, I was certain that I had closed it earlier when I was walking through. I went upstairs to close it, but as soon as I stepped foot on the second floor, I felt a strange chill in the air. It wasn't the normal cold you get in a drafty old house. This was something different. Something heavy. My breath caught in my chest. I didn't like it. I quickly shut the door and went back downstairs, telling myself that I was being silly. But after that night, things started getting weirder. I began to feel like I was being watched. It wasn't constant, but there were moments when I would be sitting in the living room and the hair on the back of my neck would stand up. I would glance over my shoulder and swear that I saw a shadow move across the hallway, just out of the corner of my eye. The feeling would disappear almost immediately, and I'd tell myself it was just the way the light was hitting the walls or a trick of my tired mind. The strange occurrences escalated slowly. A few nights later, I woke up in the middle of the night to hear faint, muffled voices coming from the hallway. At first, I thought it was just the wind carrying sounds from outside, or maybe my neighbors talking, but the sounds didn't quite match up. They were too close, too inside my house. I didn't dare get up to check. The next morning, I went into the kitchen and found a chair from the dining table had been moved to the far corner of the room. It wasn't a huge thing, but I knew it hadn't been like that the night before. I would have remembered moving it. I tried to convince myself it had been an accident. Maybe I'd bumped it while walking past, but I was certain it had been in its usual spot just hours earlier. It wasn't until a few days later that I began to question what was really going on. I had invited my friend Rachel over for dinner that evening. She was one of the few people I trusted enough to share my strange experiences with. She had always been a bit of a skeptic when it came to things like ghosts or the supernatural, but I figured she might be able to help me make sense of the odd occurrences. We sat in the living room eating pizza, laughing about old college days when the conversation turned to the house. I was hesitant to bring it up, but eventually the words slipped out. You know, I began, this house is kind of weird. I keep hearing things. Footsteps upstairs, voices, and I don't know, there's just a strange feeling about the place. Rachel raised an eyebrow. What kind of strange feeling? Like someone's watching me. And sometimes the air feels colder than it should be. There's this presence. I don't know how to explain it. Rachel gave a skeptical laugh. Oh, come on. It's probably just an old house. You've been watching too many scary movies. I smiled weakly. Maybe, but I'm telling you, something's off. Rachel didn't say much more, and we moved on to other topics. But later that evening, as we sat in the living room watching a movie, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The upstairs bedroom door, once again, was wide open. I didn't leave that open, I said, my voice trembling. Rachel looked at me, slightly confused. Maybe you did, she said with a shrug. I don't know. It's your house. I got up to close the door, but as I reached the top of the stairs, I heard something that made my heart drop into my stomach. A whisper. It wasn't clear, but it sounded like someone was calling my name, faintly from the darkness of the room. I froze, standing at the top of the stairs, my mind racing. I turned to Rachel, who had followed me up the stairs. Did you hear that? Hear what? She asked. The whisper. It came from the bedroom. Rachel's face changed. Claire, I think you need to relax. There's nothing there. I didn't listen to her. I walked into the room, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread settle over me. The room was empty, just like it had been the day before. But there was something else now, something in the air. The chill was unbearable, and then there it was, a faint outline on the floor, a handprint. It was small, like a child's hand, pressed into the dust on the hardwood floor. I bent down to inspect it, my breath shallow, my skin prickling. The mark was fresh, like someone had just left it there moments before, but no one had been in the room. Rachel gasped when she saw it, backing away toward the door. What the hell is that? I don't know, I whispered, my voice shaking. But it's not just me. That night, I barely slept. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking in the house, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I wasn't sure if it was a ghost or just my mind playing tricks on me, but I knew one thing for sure. Something in that house didn't want me there. The next morning, I left the house. I stayed with Rachel for a few days, hoping that the feeling would go away, hoping that it was all just stress. But when I returned to the house a week later to pack my things, I found something that made me never want to step foot in that place again. On the wall of the living room, in the dust, was a message written in small, deliberate letters. Leave now. I didn't hesitate. I packed up my things and moved out that same day. The landlord, Mrs. Holloway, was confused when I called her to inform her I would be leaving. She asked me what happened, but I didn't want to tell her. I didn't want to know if she had any idea what had been going on in that house before I moved in. I never returned to that house on Oakwood Drive, and I don't think I ever will. I'm not sure what I experienced there, but I know it wasn't just my imagination.
Story the end.
Story number 6.
In the spring of 2017, I moved into a charming 2-bedroom apartment in a historic building in downtown Portland, Oregon. I was young, just starting out in my career, and I was looking for a place with character. The apartment was perfect. High ceilings, hardwood floors, and large windows that looked out onto the street. The landlord, a kind elderly woman named Mrs. Miller, was more than happy to rent it to me, and I moved in without much thought beyond how beautiful the place was. The building itself had been around since the 1920s, and Mrs. Miller often told me stories about its history. There had been rumors about the building being haunted, but I wasn't one to believe in that sort of thing. Old buildings always have stories, I thought. Maybe someone had died here years ago, but I didn't think much of it. I was focused on settling in, finding a rhythm, and enjoying the peace of living alone. The first few weeks were uneventful. My days were filled with work, and my evenings were spent watching TV or reading in the quiet of my apartment. But as the days went by, small things started to happen. Things I couldn't easily explain away. It began one evening when I was sitting on the couch, reading. The apartment was dark, except for the soft light of the lamp beside me. I heard a faint sound coming from the kitchen. A soft clinking, like metal on metal. I assumed it was a spoon or something I'd left out from earlier, but when I got up to check, everything in the kitchen was exactly where I had left it. No dishes were out, no utensils clinking. I shrugged it off as my imagination, but the sound had been clear enough to startle me. A few nights later, it happened again. This time, it was the distinct sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway outside my bedroom door. I froze, listening intently. It was a solid, rhythmic step, like someone walking around in heavy boots. My heart started to race. I got up and opened the door, but the hallway was empty. Nothing was out of place. I told myself it was just the building settling. Old wood creaks, pipes make noises. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The worst night came about a week later. I had just finished a long day at work and was looking forward to a quiet night. I made myself a cup of tea and sat down on the couch, scrolling through my phone. The apartment was silent, save for the occasional creak of the building. I was just about to finish my tea when I heard it. A low, guttural sound coming from the corner of the living room. It sounded almost like a soft growl, but it wasn't an animal sound. It was too deep, too unnatural. My heart began to race, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. I set my tea down and stood up, walking cautiously toward the corner of the room. The sound stopped as soon as I moved, and when I reached the corner, there was nothing there. No animal, no object out of place. I felt my hands shake, my breath shallow. I quickly left the room and sat down at the kitchen table, trying to calm myself. I couldn't explain what had just happened. That night, I slept with the lights on, the covers pulled tightly around me. I didn't feel safe in my own apartment. The next day, I called Mrs. Miller. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I had to ask if she knew anything about strange occurrences in the building. When I mentioned hearing noises, she paused for a long time. "You're not the first to hear things," she said, her voice a little shaky. "But I didn't want to scare you." She explained that many of the tenants over the years had reported hearing footsteps, voices, or strange sounds in the night. Some had even said they felt a presence in the apartment. Mrs. Miller had always shrugged it off, but when I pressed her, she told me about a man named Richard who had lived in the building in the 1960s. Richard was a quiet man who had lived alone in the apartment directly below mine. One night, he simply vanished. No one knew where he had gone or what had happened to him. He wasn't found for several days, and when they searched his apartment, there was nothing unusual, no signs of struggle, no clues as to what had happened. "People say Richard's spirit never left," Mrs. Miller added softly. "He liked to keep to himself, but I think he's still here, wandering the halls." I felt a chill creep over me. I hadn't mentioned the noises to Mrs. Miller, but it seemed too coincidental to ignore. I tried to dismiss it, but the thought of Richard's restless spirit lingered in my mind. I wondered if he had been the one I'd heard walking around, or if it was something else altogether. For the next few days, I tried to ignore the strange happenings, but they didn't stop. I woke up one morning to find that the hallway light, which I had turned off the night before, was on again. It wasn't just the light, it was the way it flickered that unsettled me. It was as if someone had been trying to get my attention. One night, I decided to confront it head-on. I wasn't sure what I was hoping for, maybe some closure, or maybe just an answer to the unsettling feeling I couldn't shake. I stood in the middle of my living room, the lights dim, the air thick with tension, and I spoke aloud. "Richard, if you're here, I don't want to be scared anymore. I just want to know what happened to you." I didn't expect anything to happen. But then, the temperature in the room dropped dramatically. I could feel the chill on my skin, the hairs on my arms standing up. A faint whisper floated through the air, almost too quiet to hear. It sounded like a voice, but it wasn't clear. I strained to listen, but it was gone as quickly as it had come. I stepped back, my heart pounding. Something had definitely just happened. But what? Was it a coincidence, or was there really a presence in the room with me? The next morning, I left for work feeling unsettled, but determined not to let it control me. I had lived through scary things before, creaky houses, old buildings, but I had never felt anything like this. That afternoon, when I came home, I found that things had changed again. The kitchen door, which I always kept closed, was wide open. I hadn't opened it when I left, and no one had been in the apartment while I was gone. I walked inside, my stomach turning. There was something on the counter, a single old-fashioned key. I didn't recognize it, but when I picked it up, my hands trembled. It felt cold, heavier than it should have been. I ran my fingers over the key, trying to make sense of it. That's when I heard it again. The soft shuffle of footsteps, slow and measured, coming from behind me. I turned around, but no one was there. My hands went cold. The key seemed to burn in my hand, as if it were trying to tell me something. I didn't want to stay there any longer, but I couldn't leave either. I wasn't sure what to do, so I did the only thing that felt right. I placed the key on the windowsill, where I thought it might stay undisturbed. That night, after a fitful sleep, I decided it was time to leave. I couldn't stay in a place where someone was still lingering. I packed my things and told Mrs. Miller I'd be moving out. She didn't try to stop me, but she gave me a knowing look. "The apartment will find someone new," she said, almost as if she'd been waiting for me to go. I didn't stay to see who moved in after me. The apartment sat empty for months, and I moved into a new place, a more modern building, quieter, less full of history. But every now and then, when the wind is just right, I can't help but think of Richard and the things I heard in that old building. It wasn't just the noises that haunted me. It was the feeling of being watched, of never really being alone. I don't know if Richard's spirit still roams that apartment, but I do know that I won't ever forget the chill that settled over me when I asked for answers and the eerie silence that followed.
Story number 7.
I had just finished college and, like many people, I was trying to figure out what to do next with my life. I'd been living in dorms for 4 years, and now that I was finally free, I wanted to settle into something of my own. After a few weeks of searching, I found a small one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town, tucked into a quiet, older neighborhood. The rent was cheap, and the landlord seemed friendly enough, so I signed the lease and moved in. The apartment had been vacant for months, which I thought was a bit odd, but the place was charming in a slightly run-down way. The hardwood floors creaked and the walls were a little thin, but it felt like the perfect place for me to start fresh. There was a small living room, a cozy kitchen, and a bedroom that had a window looking out onto the street. The building itself was over 50 years old, with brick walls that had stories to tell. If only they could speak. The first few nights were peaceful, but things quickly started to feel strange. It wasn't anything major at first, just small, unsettling things. I'd come home from work to find things slightly out of place. A chair pushed a little too far from the table, or a book left open on the couch when I was sure I hadn't been reading it. I thought maybe I was just tired, my mind playing tricks on me after a long day. Then the noises started. I would be lying in bed at night, trying to fall asleep, and I'd hear soft thuds coming from the apartment above me. At first, I assumed it was just the neighbors, perhaps someone moving furniture or walking around. But the thuds didn't follow a pattern. Sometimes it sounded like footsteps, other times like something being dropped. The sounds would happen at all hours, late at night, early in the morning, always when the house was quiet. And then there were the whispers. It started as faint murmurs, like someone was talking in another room, just beyond the wall. I convinced myself that it was just the old building settling, the sounds of pipes and floorboards reacting to the temperature changes. But as the days went on, the whispers grew louder, clearer. They were no longer just background noise. They were distinct voices. Sometimes I'd hear my name, faintly spoken, followed by an unintelligible conversation in a language I didn't recognize. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just my mind playing tricks. After all, I hadn't had much sleep lately, and the stress of settling into a new apartment and a new life could certainly make anyone paranoid. But one night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of something scraping across the floor above me. It wasn't like a regular noise. It was slow, deliberate. It sounded like a heavy object being dragged across the floor. My heart began to race. I lay there, frozen, listening. But the noise didn't stop. I grabbed my phone, checked the time, and then texted the landlord, Mrs. Caldwell, asking if anyone else lived in the building. She'd mentioned a few tenants when I moved in, but none of them had seemed particularly active. Her response was immediate. No one should be up there at this time of night. Let me check in with the tenants. That didn't sit right with me. I had assumed there were no other units above mine. I lived on the top floor. Mrs. Caldwell had mentioned the building was small, just 3 floors, but there was nothing above me. I sat in the dark for a while, trying to shake the unease that had crept into my bones. The noise stopped after a while, but the whispers returned, now louder than before. They came from the walls, the ceiling, the very air around me. I couldn't make out the words, but they felt sinister. I wanted to get up, to check the apartment, to do something, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I was paralyzed by fear. The next day, I walked into the landlord's office to ask about the noise. Mrs. Caldwell was sitting behind her desk, sipping coffee, and when I mentioned the sounds, her face darkened. "Oh, you've heard it too then," she said quietly. "Heard what?" I asked, my voice shaking. "The noises," she said, her eyes darting around the room as if she was afraid someone might overhear. "They've been there for years." "What do you mean?" I asked, confused. "There's something in that building," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something from before. I don't know exactly what it is, but I've heard it too. The whispers, the footsteps. Sometimes it sounds like someone is crying." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "Why didn't you tell me about this when I moved in?" I asked, a little angry now. "Why didn't you warn me?" "I didn't want to scare you off," she said, her voice trembling. "But you should know that some things in this world can't be explained. I've seen things in that building, things I can't explain. I don't know if it's the house or if it's something else, but it's not just you. Everyone who's lived there has felt it." I didn't know how to respond to that. I felt a rush of dread flood through me. Mrs. Caldwell didn't seem like someone who was prone to exaggeration or tall tales. She seemed scared. And if she was scared, then I knew whatever was happening in that building wasn't something simple or easily explained. I left her office, feeling more unsettled than ever, and returned to my apartment. The rest of the day passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I started noticing things that hadn't been there before, small, strange details. A photo on the wall that wasn't hung properly, a door that was slightly ajar when I was sure I had closed it. And then, as night began to fall, the noises started again. The whispers were louder this time, and the footsteps seemed to be coming closer, until they were just outside my door. I was too terrified to move. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds. The scraping noises returned, and I could hear something dragging across the floor again, this time in the apartment next door, just on the other side of the wall. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, followed by a soft thud. I jumped out of bed, my heart racing. The door to my bedroom creaked open slowly, and I froze in place. I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel the presence in the room. It wasn't like a normal fear. It was deeper than that. Something cold, something unnatural. I turned on the light and looked around the room, but nothing was there. Everything appeared normal, as it should. But the air was thick, almost suffocating, and the feeling of being watched only intensified. That was when I saw it. The mirror on the wall, which I'd hung just a few days ago, reflected something behind me. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing in the doorway, just outside my line of sight. I spun around, but no one was there. The room was empty. I left the apartment the next morning, not knowing if I would ever go back. I stayed at a friend's house for the next few nights, but I couldn't shake the feeling of something being attached to me. When I returned to gather the rest of my things, I found that the apartment door had been left open. The mirror was cracked, even though I hadn't touched it since the night I'd seen the figure. I moved out shortly after that, and to this day, I don't know what it was that haunted that apartment. I never asked Mrs. Caldwell any more questions, but I suspect that she knew more than she was willing to tell. I don't know if it was a spirit or just the house itself, but whatever it was, it made sure I'd never forget what I'd felt inside those walls. Story the end.
Story number 8.
In the summer of 2018, I moved into an old 2-bedroom house in the outskirts of Spokane, Washington. I had just gotten out of a long relationship and needed a fresh start. The house was affordable, and although it had seen better days, it felt warm and inviting, the kind of place where you could imagine yourself creating new memories. The realtor, a middle-aged man with a slightly nervous disposition, had shown me around and told me that the house had been on the market for a while. It's an older home, you know. Some of the other tenants didn't stay long, he had said with a shrug, though I had brushed it off at the time. I wasn't overly concerned with the house's history. It was a fixer-upper, and that was what I needed. The walls were worn but not beyond repair, and the creaky wooden floors gave it a rustic charm that I found appealing. It had a cozy little kitchen, a small living room with a fireplace, and a staircase that led to the second floor. I loved the high ceilings and the way the sunlight streamed through the large windows in the morning. The first few weeks in the house were uneventful. I spent most of my time unpacking and cleaning. But as the days passed, I began to notice subtle things, small, unexplainable occurrences that made me question whether I was imagining things. It started one afternoon when I was in the kitchen. I had just put a kettle on to boil water for tea and was sorting through some boxes when I heard a faint sound, a soft thud. I turned toward the sound, but the house was still. I went back to what I was doing, but the noise came again, this time louder. It sounded like something had fallen. I walked into the hallway to investigate, but nothing seemed out of place. I checked the windows and the door to make sure nothing had blown over from the outside. I went upstairs, where the sound seemed to originate from, but found nothing there either. I attributed it to the house settling. After all, it was old. It wasn't uncommon for old homes to make strange noises. The second incident happened a few nights later. I had just come out of the shower and was standing in front of the mirror, brushing my hair. The door to the bathroom was ajar, and I could see the hallway through the gap. I thought I saw a shadow pass by, but when I glanced up, there was no one there. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly turned around to check. The hallway was empty, just as it should be. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I couldn't explain it, but the air in the room felt heavier, colder. I brushed it off as my imagination running wild. Too many horror movies and late-night TV shows, I thought. But over the next few weeks, the occurrences became more frequent, more pronounced. I started to hear footsteps at night, soft and deliberate, coming from the second floor. They would start in the hallway, moving from one room to the next, slowly pacing back and forth. At first, I convinced myself it was the house settling, or maybe even the wind, but the sounds were too regular, too purposeful. The floors creaked as if someone was walking from room to room, but when I would check, there was no one there. It wasn't just the footsteps. There were other things, too. Lights flickering on their own, objects in the living room being out of place when I knew I hadn't touched them. I would leave my keys on the coffee table and come back to find them on the kitchen counter. At first, I thought it was just me being forgetful, but it happened too many times to be a coincidence. The most disturbing occurrence came one night when I was sitting on the couch reading. It was well after midnight, and the house was quiet except for the occasional creak of the wooden floors. As I turned a page, I heard a soft whisper, like someone was speaking just behind me. I froze. The voice was indistinct, but it felt close, as if someone were standing right next to me. I quickly turned around, but no one was there. My pulse quickened. I sat still for a moment, listening, but all I could hear was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just the wind again, or maybe my imagination playing tricks on me, but the whispering returned. This time it was clearer. "Help me," the voice said. It was a woman's voice, soft but urgent. I jumped up from the couch and looked around the room. My heart pounded in my chest as I checked every corner, every shadow, but there was nothing. No one. The house was silent once more. I felt a chill run down my spine, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I knew at that moment that something was wrong, that the house was not as it seemed. I didn't sleep much that night. Every little sound seemed amplified. The creaking of the floorboards, the wind rattling the windows, the faint whispers that seemed to echo in the corners of my mind. The next morning, I called my best friend, Rachel. I told her everything that had been happening. She listened patiently but didn't say much. When I mentioned the voice, she hesitated before speaking. "Do you know anything about the house's history?" she asked. I hadn't thought to ask when I moved in. It was just an old house, and I didn't think much about it. But Rachel's question made me wonder. I did some quick research online, and what I found sent a chill through me. The house had been built in the early 1900s. A few decades later, a woman named Margaret had lived there with her husband and 2 young children. According to the old newspaper clippings I found, Margaret's husband had died suddenly in his sleep one night. It was a shock to everyone, as he had been in good health. Margaret, grief-stricken and left to raise the children alone, became a shell of the woman she once was. Not long after his death, she was found dead in the house, officially from an overdose, though some whispered that it might have been a suicide. The newspaper articles spoke of how Margaret's spirit was said to haunt the house, that people had reported hearing whispers and footsteps, just like the ones I had been hearing. The most chilling detail was that the last time anyone had seen Margaret's children, they were standing in front of the house, staring at the windows with vacant expressions before they disappeared entirely. No one ever knew what happened to them. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I read the details. It was too much of a coincidence. The voice I had heard, the footsteps, the feeling of being watched. It all made sense now. I wasn't alone in the house. Margaret's spirit was there, and maybe even the spirits of her children. They were reaching out, just as the whispers had said, "Help me." The next few days were a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, following me from room to room. The footsteps became louder, more distinct, and the whispers continued to echo in the corners of my mind. I couldn't live like this anymore. I decided to move out. The day I packed up my things, I took one last look around the house. It was quiet, almost too quiet. I stood at the front door, about to leave, when I heard the whisper again, clear as day. "Don't leave me." I turned around, but there was no one there. The house felt cold, empty, and I realized for the first time that I was truly afraid. I walked out the door and didn't look back. I never went near that house again. I heard later that the house had been sold again, but I didn't know who had moved in. I didn't want to know. I often wonder if the new tenants heard the whispers too, if they felt the weight of the house's history on their shoulders. But I know one thing for sure. I'll never forget the voice that reached out to me, pleading for help from the other side. Story at the end.
Story number 9.
In the fall of 2019, Jessica Taylor moved to the small coastal town of Hawthorne, Maine, seeking a fresh start. Recently divorced and wanting a change, she rented a quaint 2-story house near the harbor. It was old, built in the late 1800s, with chipped white paint, creaky floors, and windows that rattled in the wind. The rental agent assured her it had been vacant only a few months, left by a retired couple who moved south. Jessica immediately fell in love with the view of the rocky shoreline visible from her kitchen window. She thought the quiet solitude would be perfect for focusing on her freelance writing. The first week went by without incident, save for the occasional groan of the house settling and the wind whistling through the old window frames. But by the second week, Jessica began to notice small, strange occurrences. It started with the sound of footsteps in the upstairs hallway late at night. At first, she assumed it was just the house creaking in the cold autumn air. But the sounds were rhythmic, steady, deliberate, as though someone were pacing back and forth. One night she called out, "Hello," hoping to reassure herself that no one was there. The footsteps stopped, but no answer came. Jessica brushed it off. She told herself she was imagining things, that it was just her overactive writer's mind playing tricks on her. She distracted herself with work during the day and tried to ignore the unsettling feelings that crept in after sundown. A week later, she discovered something odd. She had a habit of leaving her notebook on the small desk in her bedroom. But one morning, she found it open to a page she hadn't written on. Scribbled across it in faint, jagged handwriting was the word, "Leave." The ink looked old, as though it had been there for decades, yet she was certain the page had been blank when she'd last seen it. Jessica stared at the word for a long time, her chest tight with unease. She convinced herself it must have been there all along, missed in her rush to unpack and settle in, yet the thought nagged at her for the rest of the day. The next few nights, she began to wake up around 3 a.m. without fail. At first, she thought it was stress, but each time, she awoke to the distinct feeling that she wasn't alone. Her skin would prickle, and the room would feel heavy, as though the air itself had thickened. She would lie perfectly still, listening for any sound, but all she could hear was her own breathing, and sometimes faintly, the creak of a floorboard down the hall. One night, as she lay awake, she heard a faint tapping on the wall next to her bed. It started slow, irregular, and then quickened, as if someone or something was trying to get her attention. Her throat tightened as she sat up, clutching her blanket. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The tapping stopped. Jessica didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, she called the rental agency to ask about the house. The agent hesitated, then finally admitted that the house had been empty for more than just a few months. In fact, it had been vacant for nearly 2 years after the sudden disappearance of a previous tenant, a woman named Lydia Harper. Lydia had been a writer, like Jessica, and had rented the house alone. According to local gossip, she vanished without a trace, leaving behind all her belongings. The case remained unsolved. Jessica felt a chill as she listened to the agent's carefully chosen words. That night, she decided to search the house more thoroughly. She started in the attic, a small, dimly lit space she had avoided since moving in. As she climbed the narrow staircase, the air grew colder, and the familiar scent of salt and damp wood filled her nostrils. In the corner of the attic, beneath a pile of old linens, she found a wooden trunk. Inside were papers, manuscripts, journals, and sketches, all belonging to Lydia Harper. Most of the writings were unfinished stories, but one notebook stood out. Its pages were filled with rambling notes about the house. "Something is here," Lydia had written in shaky handwriting. "It doesn't want me here. I hear it at night, pacing the halls. I see it in the reflection of the windows. I feel it when I sleep. I can't leave. I can't leave." Jessica slammed the notebook shut, her hands trembling. She felt the air shift around her, colder, heavier. She didn't look back as she descended the attic stairs, heart racing, her instincts screaming for her to leave the house immediately. That night, she couldn't bring herself to sleep. She sat in the living room with every light on, her phone in hand, ready to call for help if anything happened. Around 3 a.m., the lights flickered, then went out, plunging the house into darkness. Jessica's breath quickened as she scrambled to turn on her phone's flashlight. The beam illuminated the living room, casting long shadows across the walls. She heard the footsteps again, slow and deliberate, moving from the kitchen toward the stairs. Then a low, guttural whisper filled the room. She couldn't make out the words, but the malice in the tone was unmistakable. She bolted for the front door, yanking it open and running out into the chilly night. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, parked at the end of the long driveway. From the safety of her vehicle, she stared back at the house. In the second-floor window, the faint outline of a figure stood, watching her. Jessica never returned to the house. She packed her belongings during the day with the help of a few friends and left Hawthorne for good. She never told anyone else what happened, afraid they wouldn't believe her. But she couldn't forget the feeling of being watched, or the words scrawled in her notebook. Years later, she still woke at 3 a.m., haunted by the memory of the house and whatever had been waiting for her there. Story the end.
Story number 10.
In the summer of 2017, Amanda was offered a lucrative opportunity to house-sit for a couple she barely knew. The couple, Greg and Marcia, owned a sprawling home nestled deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. It was isolated, surrounded by dense woods, and the nearest neighbor was over a mile away. Amanda had recently graduated college and was trying to make ends meet, so the job sounded perfect. 2 weeks of solitude with good pay and no responsibilities beyond feeding the couple's cat and watering their plants. When Amanda arrived, the house was even larger than she'd imagined. It was a 3-story colonial-style home with white siding, black shutters, and a wraparound porch. Inside, it was a mix of modern and vintage decor, with an expansive library and a grand piano in the sitting room. Marcia gave Amanda a brief tour before they left, pointing out key areas like the kitchen and the guest bedroom Amanda would stay in. "This house has a lot of history," Marcia said casually. "It was built in 1905. We've done some renovations, but we tried to keep the original charm." Amanda nodded, impressed but distracted by the eerie stillness of the place. Something about the house felt heavy, though she brushed it off as nerves. The first night was uneventful. Amanda spent her time reading in the library and playing with the cat, a lazy gray tabby named Rufus. Around midnight, she decided to go to bed. The guest bedroom was cozy, with an antique oak bed frame and a view of the sprawling backyard. She fell asleep quickly. At 3:12 a.m., she woke with a start. The room was silent, but something felt off. Her heart raced as she strained her ears, listening. Then she heard it, a faint tapping sound, like knuckles against glass. It was coming from the window. Amanda sat up, her breath hitching. The backyard was pitch black, illuminated only by the faint glow of the moon. Gathering her courage, she got out of bed and approached the window. Nothing. Just the trees swaying in the night breeze. She convinced herself it had been a tree branch, or perhaps a bird. Still, it took her a long time to fall back asleep. The next day, she mentioned the sound to her best friend Sarah during a phone call. Sarah, always the skeptic, laughed it off. "You're in the middle of nowhere, Amanda. It's probably an animal or just your imagination." Amanda laughed along, though the unease lingered. That night, the tapping returned. This time, it was louder, more deliberate. Amanda shot up in bed, her pulse pounding. She stared at the window, frozen. The tapping continued, rhythmic and insistent. Summoning her courage, she flipped on the bedside lamp and walked to the window. Again, there was nothing there. But as she turned to go back to bed, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. A faint whisper, almost imperceptible, coming from the hallway just outside her door. "Amanda." She stood motionless, her breath caught in her throat. The voice was soft, almost childlike, but tinged with something sinister. Amanda grabbed her phone and called Sarah, her hands trembling. "It's probably just the house settling," Sarah said, though her voice was less confident this time. "Old houses make weird noises." "I heard my name," Amanda whispered. "It wasn't the house." Sarah was silent for a moment. Maybe you should just leave. Go stay in a motel or something." Amanda shook her head, even though Sarah couldn't see her. "I'm not going to freak out over a little noise. I'm fine." But she wasn't fine. The following nights grew worse. The tapping at the window became a nightly occurrence, always at 3:12 a.m. Sometimes it sounded like scratching instead, as if something or someone were trying to get in. She began hearing whispers more frequently, faint and unintelligible, but unmistakably human. They seemed to follow her, moving from room to room. One night, as Amanda sat in the living room scrolling through her phone, Rufus suddenly hissed and bolted upstairs. She looked up, startled. "Rufus?" she called. The cat didn't respond. And then she heard it. The sound of footsteps above her, slow and deliberate. Her heart sank. No one else was supposed to be in the house. She grabbed the fireplace poker and crept upstairs, her palms slick with sweat. The footsteps led her to the master bedroom. The door was slightly ajar and a faint light spilled out into the hallway. She pushed the door open, her hands trembling. The room was empty, but the walk-in closet door was open. Inside, the light bulb flickered weakly. Amanda stared at the closet, every instinct screaming at her to run. But something compelled her to step inside. As she did, she noticed something she hadn't before. The faint outline of a small door set into the back wall of the closet. It was painted the same color as the wall, almost blending in completely. She crouched down and tugged at the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. A foul, musty smell wafted up, and Amanda gagged. She should have turned back. Every part of her knew that, but curiosity, or something stronger, pulled her forward. Gripping the poker tightly, she descended the stairs. The air grew colder with each step, and the smell of damp earth and decay grew stronger. At the bottom, she found herself in a small, stone-walled room. In the center of the room was an old wooden rocking chair, its paint peeling and faded. The chair rocked gently, though there was no breeze. On the floor beside it lay an old photograph, yellowed with age. Amanda picked it up and froze. The photograph showed a family, a man, a woman, and a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old. The girl clutched a stuffed bear and stared directly at the camera, her expression blank. Amanda's stomach churned. The girl's face looked eerily familiar. It took her a moment to realize why. The girl looked exactly like her. A sudden, loud creak snapped her out of her thoughts. The rocking chair had stopped moving, and the room was now deathly silent. Amanda's chest tightened. She turned to leave, but as she did, she heard a soft giggle, a child's giggle, echoing behind her. She ran. Up the stairs, out of the closet, and back into the hallway. She slammed the bedroom door shut and locked it, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Amanda called Greg and Marcia. She tried to keep her voice steady as she asked about the house, about its history, about the strange things she'd experienced. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Greg finally spoke. "We didn't want to scare you," he said hesitantly, "but some of the previous owners reported strange things too. We've never experienced anything ourselves, but people say the house is haunted." Amanda packed her bags and left that same day, leaving a note apologizing for not finishing the house-sitting job. She drove straight back to her apartment, like vowing never to set foot in that house again. Years later, Amanda still couldn't shake the memories. Sometimes, late at night, she'd wake up at exactly 3:12 a.m., her heart racing. And sometimes, just as she was about to fall back asleep, she'd hear it again. The faint sound of tapping at her window. Story. The end.
Story number 11.
In the fall of 2017, I moved into a small apartment on the top floor of an old building in the city. The building was near the edge of downtown, not far from a park, and though it had seen better days, it was affordable. I was 24 and eager to embrace independence, having just started a new job after college. The apartment had high ceilings, exposed brick, and a charm that made it feel cozy despite its age. The landlord, an elderly man named Mr. Phelps, was quiet but kind, and after a brief tour of the space, I signed the lease. The first few days were uneventful. I unpacked my boxes, set up my furniture, and spent time exploring the neighborhood. There was a laundromat a block away, a coffee shop on the corner, and a small grocery store nearby. It was everything I needed to start my new life. But as the nights went on, I began to notice things in the apartment that I couldn't explain. It started with the lights. The overhead light in the living room would flicker intermittently, and sometimes I'd walk into a room only to find the light switched off when I was sure I had left it on. I figured it was an issue with the wiring, something I could fix when I had the time, but came the sound. Late one evening, while I was sitting on the couch, I heard footsteps above me. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed to drag across the floor as though someone was walking with heavy boots. I was startled since I knew no one lived above me. The building had only 4 units, 2 on the ground floor and 2 upstairs, and the tenant in the apartment above mine had just moved out. I called the landlord the next day, but he seemed unconcerned. "Oh, the building's old, you know. Sometimes the floorboards creak or the pipes rattle. You'll get used to it." I dismissed it as old building noises and tried to continue with my life, but the disturbances didn't stop. I started noticing things out of place. Objects that had been moved when I was sure I hadn't touched them. A glass I'd left on the counter would be on the table. A book I'd put down on the shelf would end up on the floor. It wasn't always obvious, but it was enough to make me uneasy. One night, while I was lying in bed, I felt a strange sensation. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but it felt like something was in the room with me. I sat up, scanning the shadows, but the apartment was quiet. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, but as I lay back down, I heard a soft whisper. It was so faint I almost thought I had imagined it, but it sounded like my name, Lena. I froze, my heart racing. No one was there. I was alone. I checked the apartment thoroughly, even under the bed and in the closet, but there was nothing. I chalked it up to exhaustion and tried to forget it. But as the days went on, the occurrences became more frequent. The whispering returned, sometimes clear as day, sometimes just a faint murmur. I couldn't tell if it was coming from inside my head or from somewhere in the apartment. The footsteps continued at night, and the lights flickered more often. I began to dread coming home, but I couldn't afford to leave. The apartment was the best I could do at the time. It wasn't long before I started researching the history of the building. I found out that it was built in the early 1900s, and while the history was mostly unremarkable, there was one story that caught my attention. In the 1960s, the building had been the site of a tragedy. A young woman named Sarah had lived in the apartment above mine. She had been an aspiring artist, but her life was cut short when she died in a car accident at the age of 22. The details of the accident were vague, but it was said that her death had left a dark presence in the building. A few neighbors mentioned hearing strange noises from her apartment before she died, though nothing was ever officially confirmed. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I read more about Sarah. It sounded like she had lived a solitary life, much like me. I couldn't shake the thought that maybe it was her spirit haunting the place. As the weeks went by, I grew more and more isolated. The disturbances became harder to ignore. The whispering grew louder, and I began hearing the sound of someone crying at night. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night, unable to move, as if something invisible was pressing down on my chest. Other times, I would wake up to the feeling of someone standing at the foot of my bed, but when I looked, there was no one there. One particularly unsettling night, I came home late after work and walked into my apartment to find the entire living room rearranged. The couch had been moved across the room, the coffee table was in a different spot, and my books were scattered across the floor. My heart pounded as I stared at the mess. There was no way I had done that. I had been gone all day. My phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a text from my friend Claire, asking if I was okay. I hadn't spoken to her in days, and I was startled by her message. "Are you okay? I feel like I need to check on you," the message read. I typed back, "I'm fine." "Why?" "I had a dream about you last night," she responded, "and in the dream, there was someone standing behind you. I don't know why, but it felt real, like something was following you." I stared at the screen, my hands shaking. It was a strange coincidence, but it sent a cold wave through me. Something wasn't right. That night, as I lay in bed, the whispering returned. This time it was clear and distinct, as though someone was standing beside my bed, their breath on my ear. "Help me," the voice whispered. I shot up, my heart racing, but no one was there. I turned on the lamp, my body drenched in sweat. I couldn't stay here anymore. I needed to leave. I called Mr. Phelps the next morning and told him I was moving out. He sounded surprised, but didn't argue. I packed my things in a frantic rush, desperate to escape the apartment. As I was leaving, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the hallway, just outside my door, was a painting, a small oil painting of a woman sitting by a window, looking out over the city. I had never noticed it before. It wasn't until I looked closely that I realized it was Sarah. Her eyes stared back at me, sad and hollow, as if she had been waiting for me all along. I never spoke to Mr. Phelps again after that. I moved to another apartment, one that felt safer and quieter, but I still wonder about the building sometimes. I wonder if Sarah is still there in the shadows, whispering for help, and I wonder if I was ever really alone.
Story number 12.
It was a warm spring evening in 2016 when Lucas and his wife, Emily, moved into the house they just purchased in a quiet suburban neighborhood just outside of Denver. The house was old, built in the early 1900s, a two-story Victorian-style home with a sprawling front yard and a large wooded backyard. It was a fixer-upper, but Lucas and Emily were excited to start their life there. The house had a certain charm, even though it was a little rundown. They could already picture themselves settling in, getting the place just the way they wanted it. Their first few weeks were relatively uneventful. They spent their days unpacking boxes, painting walls, and making the house feel like home. The neighbors were friendly, and the surrounding area was peaceful. But slowly, as time passed, Emily began to notice odd things happening around the house. Small things at first, things she could explain away. It started one night when she was getting ready for bed. She went into the bathroom to brush her teeth and noticed the bathroom mirror had fogged up, but only in one corner. The fog formed the shape of a handprint, as if someone had touched it while it was still damp. Emily was unsettled, but she figured it was just condensation or perhaps the result of the old plumbing. She wiped it off and went to bed. The next morning, Lucas noticed a strange smell in the house, something musty and old, like damp wood. They had just moved in, so Emily assumed it was from the house settling or from some minor water damage that would need to be fixed. But over the next few days, the smell grew stronger, and no matter how much they cleaned, it lingered in the air. Around the same time, Lucas started hearing strange sounds in the middle of the night. It wasn't a regular creaking of the house settling, but something else. He would hear footsteps above them, walking slowly down the hallway, as if someone were pacing. He'd wake up, listen carefully, but the sounds would always stop when he tried to get up and investigate. He assumed it was just the house, a little weird, but nothing out of the ordinary. One night, after a long day of unpacking, Emily was sitting in the living room, reading a book. Lucas was in the kitchen making dinner. It was getting late, and the house was quiet, the only sound coming from the soft hum of the refrigerator. Emily paused for a moment, hearing what she first thought was Lucas coming from the upstairs hallway, but then she heard it again. Footsteps. They were heavy, deliberate, and seemed to be moving closer to the stairs. She called out to Lucas, assuming he was walking around upstairs, but there was no response. She got up and made her way to the stairs, calling again, but still nothing. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she stopped short. The hallway was empty. She stood there for a moment, unsure if she had imagined the sounds. She glanced up the stairs, but there was no sign of Lucas. She turned around to go back downstairs, but as she did, she felt a cold breath on the back of her neck. She froze. The air in the room felt colder, and she could almost feel something watching her. She quickly returned to the living room, feeling her heart race. She didn't tell Lucas, not wanting to worry him. Maybe she was just tired, she thought. Maybe she was imagining things. The following week, Lucas and Emily were sitting at the kitchen table, eating dinner, when they heard a loud bang from upstairs. They both jumped, startled. The sound had come from the guest bedroom, which they had not even begun to unpack yet. It was as though something had fallen, but neither of them had been upstairs. Hesitantly, they both got up and went to check. When they opened the door, they were shocked to find the room completely undisturbed. Nothing had fallen. Nothing had moved. But the temperature in the room had dropped significantly. It was as if a chill had settled there, leaving them both feeling uneasy. The next day, Emily was cleaning the guest bedroom when she found something strange. A torn, yellowed photograph under the bed. It was a picture of a young woman, her face partially obscured by shadows, standing in front of a house that looked remarkably similar to theirs. Emily picked it up, examining it closely. The woman in the photo had a distant, almost sorrowful look on her face. Her eyes were empty, as if staring past the camera. "Who is this?" Emily asked aloud, though she was unsure if she was asking the photo or herself. Lucas came into the room, saw the picture, and took it from her hands. He studied it for a moment before shaking his head. "I don't know. Maybe it was left by the previous owners." Later that evening, Emily mentioned the photo to their neighbor, Mrs. Calloway, who had lived on the block for decades. When Emily showed her the picture, Mrs. Calloway's expression shifted, becoming tight and anxious. "You found that in the guest room?" she asked quietly, her voice lowering. "I thought we had gotten rid of all of that stuff." Emily frowned. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Calloway hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if she were making sure no one was listening. "That woman. She lived here a long time ago. Her name was Eleanor. She was the last person to live in that house before you bought it. She." Mrs. Calloway stopped herself, her eyes darting nervously. "It's a sad story. I'll just say this. Eleanor died in that room, and after she passed, the house was never quite the same." The chill in Emily's spine deepened, but she didn't press Mrs. Calloway for more information. Mrs. Calloway quickly excused herself, leaving Emily standing in her doorway, the unsettling weight of the conversation lingering in the air. That night, the footsteps returned, but this time, they weren't just upstairs. They were in the hallway outside their bedroom door. Slow, deliberate, and accompanied by the faintest whisper of a woman's voice. The voice sounded distant, but the words were clear. "Help me." Emily sat up in bed, heart pounding in her chest. She turned to Lucas, but he was fast asleep, unaware of the chilling sounds that were coming from just outside their door. She tried to shake him awake, but as her fingers brushed against his arm, she froze. Something was wrong. Lucas's body was cold to the touch, colder than she had ever felt. She tried to wake him again, shaking him harder, but there was no response. Panicking, she jumped out of bed and grabbed her phone, dialing 911. The operator on the other end answered, but before Emily could say anything, Lucas suddenly gasped for air, jerking awake as if he had been underwater. "Emily?" he muttered groggily, still disoriented. "What's going on?" She could hardly catch her breath. You were unresponsive, Lucas. I thought..." Lucas cut her off, sitting up in bed and looking around. "I'm fine. What happened?" She didn't know what to say. The room was silent, save for the sound of their quickened breathing. She looked at him, still shaking. Then, as if the world were spinning too fast, she heard it again, the soft, mournful whisper from the hallway. "Help me." The voice faded, and the temperature in the room seemed to return to normal. The night was still again, and Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong with the house. The next day, they packed their things and left. Emily couldn't bear to stay another night in that house. Lucas, still bewildered by what had happened, agreed. They called a realtor and listed the house for sale the following week. They never went back. Years later, Emily learned that the house had been abandoned for several years before they moved in. Eleanor had passed away there under mysterious circumstances. Some said it was a tragic accident, while others whispered of something more sinister. No one ever stayed in the house long enough to find out. Sometimes Emily still hears the whispers in her dreams, soft, sad whispers from the past, begging for help.
Story number 13.
In the summer of 2018, I moved into a small, century-old apartment building in the heart of the city. It was a quiet, tucked-away building that had always intrigued me every time I passed by it. The apartment itself was small but cozy, with wooden floors that creaked underfoot and an old gas stove that seemed to be straight out of the 1930s. The landlord, Mrs. O'Leary, was an elderly woman with a gentle smile and a soft voice. She had a reputation for being particular about who she rented to, but after a brief chat, she agreed to let me move in. Everything was perfect at first, until a few weeks later when things began to change. The first strange occurrence happened late one evening when I was working at my desk. It was around 10 p.m., and I was still finishing up some emails. The building was quiet, as it always was at night, but suddenly I heard something, faint but unmistakable, a soft tapping, as though someone were knocking at the door. At first, I assumed it was my neighbor. There was an older woman who lived across the hall, Mrs. Williams, who liked to chat about the weather or neighborhood gossip. I got up to open the door, but when I looked through the peephole, there was no one standing outside. I shrugged it off. Maybe I had imagined it. The next night, it happened again. This time, the knocking came at 3 a.m., much louder than before. I jumped out of bed, heart racing. When I opened the door, there was no one in the hallway. I stepped out cautiously and looked down both ends, but it was empty. I called Mrs. O'Leary the next morning to ask if she knew of any issues with the building's plumbing or heating system that might explain the noise, but she just chuckled and told me not to worry. "The old building likes to play tricks on new tenants," she said. "It's probably the pipes or the wind." For the next few weeks, I tried to forget about it, but the noises continued. Knocking at the door, scraping sounds against the walls, even soft whispers that seemed to float from the corners of the room when I was alone. It wasn't always at night. Sometimes I would hear the whispering during the day when the apartment was quiet. I'd walk into a room and feel the air grow colder, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I didn't want to believe it, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized something was off about this place. It was around the end of June when I started to notice something else. Things began to move. Books on my shelves would be shifted to different spots, sometimes even stacked in ways I didn't remember doing. My kitchen utensils would be out of place, as though someone had used them after I had already cleaned up. I even found my keys in the refrigerator one morning. I told myself I was just being forgetful. Maybe I had misplaced them without realizing it. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. One evening, I was sitting on the couch trying to relax when I saw a shadow move across the room. I glanced toward the door, but no one was there. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and the temperature seemed to drop by several degrees in seconds. It was then that I began to feel truly uncomfortable in my own apartment. I tried to tell myself it was just stress, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. The whispers grew louder, and I began to hear footsteps at night. Slow, deliberate steps that sounded like someone pacing back and forth in the hallway. I would sometimes hear them even when I was in bed, and I would freeze, too terrified to get up and investigate. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to go for a walk around the building. The hallway was dark, and as I passed by each door, I couldn't help but feel like someone was watching me from behind them. When I reached the stairwell, I noticed something strange. At the bottom of the stairs, in the shadows, I could see a figure. Faint, almost translucent. It was a woman, standing perfectly still, staring up at me with wide, empty eyes. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I could see her more clearly now. Her hair was long and unkempt, her clothes tattered as though she had been trapped there for years. I didn't know what to do, so I ran back up to my apartment, slamming the door behind me and locking it. The next day, I called Mrs. O'Leary and told her what had happened. She went quiet for a long moment before speaking. "You saw her, didn't you?" she asked softly. I was confused. "Who? What are you talking about?" "The woman who used to live in that apartment. Her name was Evelyn. She was a young woman, about your age, and she lived here a long time ago. She died here, right in your apartment." My blood ran cold as Mrs. O'Leary continued. "She was a troubled soul. She was alone a lot, and she had a habit of staying up late, reading or writing letters to people she never saw. One day, she just stopped coming out of her apartment. The neighbors tried to check on her, but no one could get in. When the police finally forced the door open, they found her lying on the floor. The official cause of death was a heart attack, but some say she was never truly alone in that apartment. Some say something took her." I sat in stunned silence. I had no idea. Mrs. O'Leary's voice trembled as she spoke. "Some of the tenants still report seeing her. It's a strange thing, but I think she's still here, lingering." That night, as I lay in bed, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I hadn't told anyone about the shadowy figure I'd seen in the hallway, but now I was certain it wasn't just my imagination. The whispering grew louder, and I could hear footsteps pacing again, slow and deliberate, coming closer and closer to my bedroom door. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. And then the door handle rattled. I jumped out of bed, my heart pounding in my throat. The door was locked, but I could feel something on the other side. The handle rattled again, this time more violently, as though someone was trying to break through. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my things and ran out of the apartment, slamming the door behind me. I didn't know where to go, but I couldn't stay there. For the next few days, I stayed with a friend, too shaken to go back to the apartment. When I finally returned, the building was quiet. The knocking had stopped. The whispering had ceased. But when I walked into my apartment, I noticed something strange. My desk, where I had left my notebook, was now covered in small, carefully arranged piles of paper. It looked like someone had been writing on them. There was no mistaking it. The words were not my own. "Leave me alone," they read. It was at that moment that I knew I had to leave for good. I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. I packed up my belongings, gave my notice to Mrs. O'Leary, and moved out the next week. To this day, I wonder if Evelyn still lingers in that apartment, waiting for someone to listen, to understand. And sometimes when I pass that building, I swear I can see her figure in the window, watching me from the darkness. Story the end.
Story number 14.
It was the fall of 2017 when Sarah first moved into the old house on Laurel Drive. She had just landed her dream job at a tech company in Seattle, and the timing couldn't have been better. The house was affordable, and though it was an older property, it had been well maintained. The neighborhood was quiet, with tree-lined streets and well-kept lawns. It was everything Sarah had been hoping for. The house was a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom craftsman with dark wooden floors and a cozy front porch. It had a slightly eerie charm to it, but Sarah figured it was just the age of the house. She'd always loved older homes, so the slightly worn paint and creaky floors didn't bother her. On her first night, she unpacked and settled in, excited about the new chapter in her life. The neighbors had been friendly when she met them earlier that day, and she spent the evening getting familiar with the house. The quiet was soothing, and the warmth from the fireplace in the living room made it feel like home. It wasn't until the second week that things started to feel strange. At first, it was little things, small noises in the middle of the night, like someone walking around upstairs when she was certain she was alone. She chalked it up to the house settling. After all, it was an old home with creaky floors and rattling windows. But as time went on, the strange occurrences became harder to ignore. One night, after finishing up work, Sarah went to the kitchen to grab a snack. When she entered, the kitchen light was on, despite the fact that she was sure she had turned it off earlier. She thought it might have been an oversight, but then the same thing happened the next night and the night after that. It was only a few days later that Sarah noticed something even more unsettling. She had left a glass of water on the kitchen counter before going to bed. The next morning, the glass was gone. She checked the whole kitchen, but there was no sign of it. Initially, she figured it had fallen into the sink or been moved by accident, but when she checked the trash can and every cupboard, it was nowhere to be found. The house was small enough that it wasn't hard to keep track of things. If something was misplaced, Sarah would usually find it in a matter of minutes, but the glass never turned up. This unsettled her more than she cared to admit, but still, she told herself it was nothing, just her imagination running wild. But it was a few days later when things escalated. One evening, Sarah had just come home from work and was sitting on the couch, reading. The house was quiet, save for the faint sound of traffic in the distance and the occasional creak of the wooden beams. She heard a faint scratching noise, like fingernails dragging along wood. The sound seemed to come from upstairs, and Sarah froze, heart pounding in her chest. She had always been a rational person, so she tried to convince herself it was just a mouse or a loose shutter banging in the wind. But the scratching grew louder, almost rhythmic, as if it was deliberately trying to get her attention. Finally, she stood up and walked to the bottom of the stairs, her pulse quickening. "Hello?" she called out, half expecting someone to be there, but the house was still. She waited for a few moments, but the noise didn't return. Shaking her head, she went back to the living room, though her unease lingered. Over the next few weeks, the strange events continued. The sounds grew more frequent, whispers when she was alone, creaking floors when she was sitting perfectly still, and the occasional cold spot that would appear in the middle of a room. Sarah dismissed it all as the house's natural quirks, but the increasing frequency of the disturbances made it harder to ignore. Then came the night she would never forget. Sarah had been at work late, wrapping up a project with a tight deadline. She arrived home around 11 p.m. and, as usual, went straight to the kitchen to grab a snack. She was exhausted and didn't think twice about the dim light that flickered above her. She grabbed a granola bar and sat down at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone. But then she heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps on the stairs. Her breath caught in her throat. The house was empty. She was alone, and the footsteps couldn't have been anyone else. Frozen in place, Sarah listened as the sound of footsteps came closer. Each step was slow, methodical, as if whoever was upstairs knew exactly where she was. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed the nearest object she could find, a kitchen knife, and slowly made her way toward the stairs. Her hands were shaking as she reached the bottom step. There was no one there, just an empty hallway. The footsteps stopped. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and her breathing felt shallow as she peered up the stairs. She hesitated, looking back at the door, but something pulled her forward. She made her way up the staircase, one step at a time, the soft creak of the wooden stairs almost deafening in the silence. As she reached the top, she felt a sudden coldness wash over her, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. The air felt thick, as though the house itself was holding its breath. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is anyone here?" There was no answer. With her heart pounding in her chest, Sarah checked each room. Empty. Her hands were clammy, and her mind raced with possibilities. There was no logical explanation. No one had broken into the house. There was no one else here. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her, standing just out of sight. She turned to head back downstairs, but as she reached the landing, the door to the guest bedroom, the one she rarely used, creaked open on its own. Sarah stopped in her tracks, staring at the door as it swung open slowly, almost inviting her in. The guest bedroom was dark, save for the moonlight that filtered through the blinds. She swallowed hard, every instinct telling her to run, to get out of the house as quickly as possible. But she couldn't move. It was as if something was holding her there, forcing her to look inside. And then she saw it. Standing in the far corner of the room, just at the edge of the shadows. A figure, tall and thin, with long, disheveled hair. It was staring directly at her, its features hidden in the darkness, but Sarah could feel its eyes on her, burning into her very soul. Her heart slammed against her chest as she stumbled backward, tripping over her own feet. She ran down the stairs, out the front door, and into the street. She didn't stop running until she reached the neighbor's house, pounding on the door, breathless and terrified. Mrs. Jenkins, an elderly woman who lived next door, answered the door. She took one look at Sarah's panicked face and ushered her inside. "Are you all right, dear?" Mrs. Jenkins asked, concern in her eyes. Sarah could barely speak. She sat down, her hands trembling, trying to gather her thoughts. I saw something," she stammered. "In the house, something in the guest room." Mrs. Jenkins's face softened with understanding. "You saw it, didn't you? What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah, this house, it's been here for a long time. Before you moved in, there were rumors. Strange things have happened here over the years. People have left without ever explaining what happened." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. "What happened? What did they see?" Mrs. Jenkins shook her head, her expression growing somber. "I don't know the full story, but whatever's in that house isn't just a ghost. It's something else, something that was never meant to be disturbed." That night, Sarah stayed with Mrs. Jenkins, too terrified to return to the house. The next morning, she packed her belongings and moved out. She never spoke of the house again, but she never fully escaped the feeling that someone or something was still watching her. Story the end.
Story number 15.
I moved into the small town of Hollow Ridge in the fall of 2017. I had just finished college and got my first job at a small marketing firm. The town was quiet, peaceful. Exactly what I thought I needed after living in the chaos of the city. The apartment I rented was an old duplex on the edge of town, built in the early 1900s. It had a certain charm to it, worn hardwood floors, big windows, a fireplace that didn't quite work but added to the aesthetic. The landlord, Mr. Keller, was an older man, gruff but kind. He told me the duplex had been in his family for generations, but that his children had all moved away, leaving him to look after the property. From the first night, I felt something was off. At first, I attributed it to the fact that I had just moved into a new place, but the feeling lingered. The apartment had an odd, heavy atmosphere. It wasn't oppressive, but more like a presence you couldn't quite shake. When I was alone, I'd sometimes hear the faint sound of footsteps from the floor above. I lived on the bottom floor, and the apartment above was vacant, so I thought maybe it was the house settling. But these footsteps sounded too deliberate, too steady to be the creaks of an old building. I tried to ignore it at first, chalking it up to the natural quirks of living in an old place. I had always liked old buildings, and this one had character, something modern apartments just couldn't offer. But the noises persisted, and over the next few weeks, they grew more frequent. At night, I'd hear soft taps on the walls, sometimes accompanied by a low murmur that seemed like a voice, too faint to make out the words. One night, I decided to get to the bottom of it. I had just finished a late shift at work and was sitting on the couch, trying to wind down. As I sat there, the tapping started again, this time louder, more insistent. My heart began to race. It wasn't just the occasional creak anymore. I stood up, walking toward the hallway, listening carefully. The sound was coming from the kitchen. I took a few cautious steps forward, but the moment I crossed into the kitchen, the noise stopped. I stood still, waiting for a few moments, but there was nothing, just silence. I shook my head, convinced it was my nerves getting the best of me. But as I turned to head back to the living room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A shadow, tall and thin, passed by the doorway. It wasn't the shadow of a person. I could tell by the way it moved. It seemed to glide, floating across the hall like smoke. I froze, staring at the spot where the shadow had passed. My breath caught in my throat, and I quickly walked toward the door, yanking it open and peering into the darkness of the hallway. Nothing. I stood there for a long time, the silence now deafening. After a few minutes, I closed the door and locked it, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. Something wasn't right about this place. The next day, I did some research on the building. The town's history wasn't well documented, but I managed to find an old newspaper article from the 1940s that mentioned the duplex. It said that the upper floor had once been the home of a family named the Hargraves, parents with 2 young children. The article didn't give many details, but it mentioned that the family had abruptly disappeared one night. There were no traces of them found in the house, and the authorities had no leads. The case went cold, and the property was eventually rented out to others. It made sense now, I thought. The strange noises, the shadows, it was all tied to the house's history. I had read about hauntings before, so I wasn't entirely unprepared for the idea of living in a place with a ghost. I figured the best thing to do was to ignore it, move on with my life, and try not to think too much about the past. But ignoring it didn't work. The disturbances continued, becoming more frequent as the weeks went by. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of muffled crying coming from upstairs. I'd stand in the doorway of the kitchen, staring at the spot where I had seen the shadow before, and I'd hear footsteps, heavy, slow, and dragging, as though someone was walking with a limp. Sometimes I'd wake up to find the furniture moved. Nothing major, just slight shifts. A chair turned a little, a book knocked off the shelf. But it was enough to unsettle me. One evening, I had had enough. I was sitting at my kitchen table, reading, when I heard the distinct sound of a door creaking open upstairs. I stood up, my pulse quickening, and walked toward the staircase that led to the upper floor. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I heard a voice, clear this time, not a murmur, but a full sentence. "Help us." I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart thundering in my chest. I had no idea where the voice was coming from. It didn't sound like a real person. It was more like an echo, hollow and distant, but still unmistakable. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky. The silence that followed was suffocating. I waited, but there was no response. Slowly, I made my way up the stairs, my body tense with fear. When I reached the top, the hallway was dark, empty. I called out again, but this time no voice answered. It was at that moment that I heard it. Soft laughter, not from upstairs, but from behind me. I spun around, my heart nearly stopping as I saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was a woman, her features obscured by shadow, but I could see her clearly enough to know she wasn't real. She was transparent, her form flickering in and out like a bad signal on a television screen. Before I could react, the woman vanished, and I was left standing in the hallway, completely alone. I ran back to my apartment, heart racing, and locked myself inside. For the next few days, I barely slept. I couldn't shake the image of the woman. Who was she? Was it one of the Hargraves, or was it someone else who had died in the house? I couldn't stop thinking about the voice, the laughter, the feeling of being watched at all times. The next day, I spoke to Mr. Keller. I didn't mention the ghost, but I asked if he knew anything about the history of the house, anything more than the article I had found. He hesitated before speaking. "The Hargraves weren't the first to live there," he said, his voice low. "There were others before them. The house has seen its share of tragedy, and some people say it's cursed. People who live here don't stay long. I've seen it happen time and time again. They move in, and after a few months, they leave without saying a word. It's as if something drives them out." His words confirmed what I had feared. The house wasn't just haunted, it was cursed, and whatever was there wasn't going to let me leave without a fight. I didn't stay much longer. Within the week, I found a new place, one far away from Hollow Ridge. When I moved out, I didn't look back. I didn't want to know what happened to the Hargraves or anyone else who had come before me. I just wanted to get out of that place. To this day, I still wonder if it was just my imagination, if the house's history was just an old tale told to scare new tenants. But I know what I felt, what I heard, and what I saw. The house was not empty, and the things that lived there weren't ready to let anyone go.
Story number 16.
I had always been a skeptic when it came to ghost stories. I'd grown up hearing all sorts of bizarre tales, things like objects moving by themselves, flickering lights, and strange sounds in the night, but I had never believed any of it. I thought it was all just imagination, or maybe some odd coincidence. But that all changed in the summer of 2017 when I moved into the old house on Birch Street. I found the place through a friend of a friend. It was a modest two-story home set on a quiet street in a small town about an hour outside of Portland, Oregon. The house had character. Some might even call it charming. It was built in the 1920s and had an old-school feel to it, with a large backyard and overgrown ivy creeping up the sides of the house. The rent was cheap, which was a big draw for me. At the time, I had just started a new job in town and needed a place quickly. The first few days in the house were uneventful. It was exactly what I needed, a quiet place to relax after a long workday. There were no glaring issues with the house except for the musty smell in the basement, but that seemed typical for older homes. I didn't give it much thought and chalked it up to old pipes or dampness. However, as the weeks passed, I started noticing little things. A flickering light here, a creak in the floorboards there. I told myself it was just the house settling, old plumbing, or the wind making the windows rattle. But then things began to escalate. It started with the kitchen lights. They would flicker sporadically, and I would have to go over and tap the switch to get them to work again. At first, I assumed it was a simple electrical issue, but then one evening I was standing in the kitchen when the light above me suddenly went out. I flipped the switch a few times, but nothing happened. I was about to walk out of the room to get a new bulb when the light flickered back on, brighter than before. I thought it was strange, but didn't think too much about it at the time. It wasn't long after that I started hearing things. Footsteps, soft and slow, moving across the floor upstairs in the middle of the night. It didn't happen every night, but on the nights it did, I couldn't sleep. The footsteps would echo in the silence, making me feel as though someone was walking around the house while I was in bed. I'd get up to check, but there was never anyone there. One night, after hearing the footsteps again, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and crept upstairs. My heart raced as I walked down the hallway to the bedrooms. I checked each one, but nothing seemed out of place. It felt colder than usual, and I started to get the sense that I wasn't alone. I stood still for a few moments, listening for any sound, but everything was silent again. I was about to turn around and head back down the stairs when I noticed something odd. The door to the guest room, which I rarely used, was slightly ajar. I could have sworn I had closed it earlier. I pushed the door open and shone my flashlight around the room, but it was empty. Nothing was disturbed. I exhaled in relief, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But as I turned to leave, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A chair, which had been in the corner when I entered, was now facing the door. It was positioned at an angle, as though someone had been sitting in it and had just gotten up. I didn't remember moving it, and there was no way the chair could have shifted on its own. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity before slowly backing out of the room. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing the same footsteps, louder now, pacing back and forth upstairs. It felt like whatever was in the house was getting closer, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. A few days later, things got even stranger. I was sitting on the couch reading a book when I heard a loud bang coming from upstairs. It sounded like something heavy had fallen, or maybe a door slamming. My heart skipped a beat as I jumped to my feet. I called out, but there was no answer. I hesitated for a moment, then grabbed my phone and texted my friend, just to have someone to talk to. She responded quickly, telling me to stop being paranoid. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I went upstairs, checking every room again. Everything seemed fine, except for the guest room. The door was wide open, and this time, the chair was in the middle of the room. It wasn't just facing the door. It was positioned as though someone had been sitting in it and had gotten up suddenly, leaving the chair in the middle of the room. I was about to leave the room when I noticed something else. A photograph, face down on the floor beside the chair. I bent down to pick it up, and when I turned it over, my stomach dropped. It was a black and white photo of an older woman sitting in that very chair. The woman had a stern, almost angry expression on her face. I didn't recognize her, but there was something about her eyes that made my skin crawl. I stood there for a long time, staring at the photo, trying to make sense of it. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. The footsteps were louder than ever, and at one point I heard a faint voice. It was a whisper, too faint to make out, but it sounded like a woman, saying something over and over. I tried to ignore it, but it grew louder, almost as though it were right beside me. I bolted upright in bed, heart racing. But again, there was nothing there. By the end of the week, I'd had enough. I called a local paranormal investigator named Diane, who had come highly recommended. She agreed to come to the house and perform an investigation. When she arrived, she immediately noted the strange energy in the house, though she didn't say much more. After setting up some equipment, she began asking questions, trying to communicate with whatever was there. For an hour, nothing happened, but then the temperature in the room dropped. I felt it immediately, the cold seeping into my skin. It was unnerving. Diane paused for a moment, then spoke again, her voice firm. "Is there anyone here?" she asked, and there was a long silence. Then a sound, footsteps, soft but clear. Diane nodded as though she had been expecting it. "We know you're here." Suddenly, the lights flickered, the temperature dropped further, and I could see my breath in the air. I felt a presence behind me, and I turned quickly. Standing in the doorway of the guest room was the figure of a woman, pale, thin, and wearing a dark, old-fashioned dress. She was staring directly at me, her eyes hollow and dark. I didn't scream. I couldn't. I was frozen, unable to move, my breath caught in my throat. The figure remained motionless for what felt like hours, then slowly faded away, disappearing into the darkness. Diane didn't need to say anything. The look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. "It's her?" she said softly. "She's been here for a long time." I didn't stay in the house after that. The following day, I packed up my things and moved out, leaving behind everything I couldn't take with me. The house sat in silence, as though nothing had ever happened. I never learned who the woman was or what she wanted. But I couldn't forget the look in her eyes, the cold, empty stare that haunted me long after I left Birch Street. Story the end.